The city woke up early every morning. Before the sun fully appeared, the streets were already alive with movement. Small food carts rolled onto the sidewalks, shop owners lifted metal shutters, and buses roared through the crowded roads carrying people who were rushing to start their long day. The noise of engines, footsteps, and distant conversations mixed together to create a rhythm that never seemed to stop. Among the many people walking through those streets was a quiet teenage girl who rarely drew anyone's attention. She wore simple clothes that had been carefully washed many times but were starting to fade with age. Her shoes were a little worn, and her small bag hung loosely on her shoulder. Nothing about her appearance made people turn their heads. Most of the time, she blended into the background like just another face in the busy crowd. Her life had never been easy. She lived with her mother in a tiny rented room at the edge of the city where the buildings were older and the streets were narrower. Their room was small, with just enough space for 2 beds, a small table, and a shelf filled with a few everyday items. When it rained, water sometimes leaked through the roof, and they would place old buckets underneath to catch the drops. Her mother worked long hours at a small tailoring shop. Every day she stitched clothes for people she would probably never meet. The work was tiring, but it helped pay the rent and buy simple food. Some days were better than others, but money was always tight. There were moments when they had to carefully count every coin before buying groceries. Despite these struggles, the girl rarely complained. She had learned from a young age that life was not always fair. Instead of focusing on what she didn't have, she quietly held on to something that gave her comfort. Music. She didn't know exactly when her love for music had begun. Maybe it started when she was very young and heard a melody floating out of a shop window. Maybe it happened the first time she heard a soft piano piece playing on an old radio somewhere in the neighborhood. Whatever the reason, the sound of piano music always stopped her in her tracks. Whenever she heard those gentle notes, something inside her became calm. The world felt softer. The noise of the city seemed to fade away for a moment. There was just one small problem. She had never touched a piano. In her neighborhood, owning a piano was something people could only imagine. Most homes were small, and families were busy trying to manage daily expenses. Musical instruments were considered a luxury, something that belonged in large houses, concert halls, or expensive schools. But even though she had never played one, the sound of the piano stayed in her mind. Every day after finishing her small chores or helping her mother when she could, she liked to walk through different parts of the city. She didn't do it to shop or to meet friends. She simply walked and listened. Sometimes music floated out from open windows. Sometimes it came from cafes or restaurants where musicians played quietly in the background. Whenever she heard piano notes, she slowed down. If the place had a window, she would stop nearby and listen carefully. She would close her eyes for a few seconds and imagine the keys under her fingers. In her mind, she could almost feel them. Black keys, white keys, soft sounds rising into the air. People passing by often thought she was just resting or daydreaming. No one realized she was memorizing every sound. The strange thing was that her memory for music was strong. When she returned home at night, she would quietly tap rhythms on the table or the side of her bed, trying to remember the melodies she had heard earlier in the day. Sometimes her mother would notice and smile gently. "You like music a lot," her mother once said while folding some clothes. The girl nodded shyly. "I wish we had a piano," she said softly. Her mother paused for a moment. She didn't answer right away, not because she didn't care, but because she knew how impossible that dream sounded. Still, she gave a small, encouraging smile. "Dreams are good," she said kindly, "even if they take time." Those words stayed with the girl. Years passed quietly, and her habit of listening to music never changed. If anything, it became stronger. She began recognizing certain melodies after hearing them only once or twice. Sometimes she even predicted the next note before it played. But she kept all of this to herself. No one in school knew about her secret fascination with the piano. Her classmates mostly talked about games, movies, or weekend plans. She listened politely, but she rarely joined those conversations. Her mind was usually somewhere else, following invisible melodies. One evening, after finishing a small errand for her mother, she decided to take a slightly different route home. The sun was beginning to set, and the sky was painted with warm orange and pink colors. The city lights were slowly turning on one by one. As she walked along the street, she noticed a restaurant she had never paid much attention to before. It wasn't extremely fancy, but it looked comfortable and welcoming. Through the large front window, she could see people sitting at tables enjoying their meals. Then something caught her eye. Near the window, placed gently against the wall, stood a beautiful piano. It was polished and dark, reflecting the soft lights hanging from the ceiling. Even from outside, it looked elegant and important, like something that held many stories inside it. Her steps slowed down immediately. She moved a little closer to the window. Inside the restaurant, quiet music was playing from speakers, and people were chatting peacefully. The piano itself was not being used at the moment. Simply stood there, waiting. The girl felt her heart beat a little faster. She had seen pianos before in shops or behind closed doors, but this one felt different. It was so close, just a few steps away. For a long moment, she stood outside the window without moving. People passed behind her on the sidewalk, but she didn't notice. Her eyes stayed fixed on the instrument. In her mind, she imagined what it would feel like to sit in front of it. She imagined pressing one key gently and hearing the sound fill the room. The thought made her nervous and excited at the same time. Of course, she knew it was unrealistic. Restaurants were private places. People went there to eat, not to watch strangers experiment with musical instruments. Still, something inside her refused to walk away. Minutes passed. She continued standing there, quietly watching the piano through the glass window as if it might disappear if she blinked. A small voice inside her mind whispered a simple question. What if? What if she could try just once? The idea seemed bold, maybe even foolish. She had never played a real piano before. People might laugh. Someone might ask her to leave. But another feeling pushed back against those fears. Curiosity. All the melodies she had collected in her memory over the years felt like they were gently calling her. The door of the restaurant opened as a couple walked out, laughing and talking. Warm light spilled onto the sidewalk. The girl looked at the doorway. Then she looked back at the piano. Her hands tightened slightly around the strap of her bag. She took a slow breath. For a moment she hesitated, standing right there between doubt and courage. Then, quietly and carefully, she stepped toward the entrance. The simple decision would soon turn into a moment that no one inside the restaurant would forget. The restaurant door closed softly behind her, and for a moment she just stood there. The warm air inside felt very different from the busy street outside. The sound of quiet conversations mixed with the soft clinking of plates and glasses. Gentle lights hung from the ceiling, giving the whole place a calm and comfortable feeling. She had stepped into places like this before only to deliver small items or run errands for someone else. Sitting down and eating in a restaurant like this was not something she was used to. Because of that, she felt a little nervous standing near the entrance. People were sitting at tables talking with their friends or families. Some were laughing, some were enjoying their meals, and others were simply relaxing after a long day. No one expected anything unusual to happen that evening. The girl slowly looked around the room. Then her eyes found the piano again. It stood near the window just like she had seen from outside. Up close, it looked even more beautiful. The smooth surface reflected the soft lights of the restaurant, and the piano bench sat neatly in front of it as if waiting for someone to sit down. For a few seconds, she forgot everything else around her. The instrument seemed almost alive. Her heart began to beat faster again. She reminded herself that she had only come inside to ask politely. If someone said no, she would simply leave. There was nothing wrong with asking. Taking a small step forward, she began walking slowly across the restaurant. At first, most people didn't pay attention to her. She looked like someone who might be waiting for a table or looking for someone she knew. But as she continued moving closer to the piano, a few heads started to turn. A waiter standing near the counter noticed her walking in that direction. He watched her for a moment with curiosity but didn't say anything yet. The girl reached the piano and stood beside it quietly. Up close, she could see the black and white keys clearly. They looked smooth and perfectly lined up. She had imagined them so many times in her mind, but seeing them right in front of her felt almost unreal. She gently placed her hand on the side of the piano, not touching the keys yet. The surface was cool and polished. For a moment she simply stood there, taking it all in. Then she turned toward the nearby waiter. Her voice was soft, but she tried to speak clearly. "Excuse me," she said politely. The waiter walked over with a curious expression. He seemed unsure about what she wanted. "Yes?" he asked. The girl hesitated for a second. She wasn't used to asking strangers for things like this. "I was wondering," she began slowly, "if I could try playing the piano for a moment." The waiter blinked in surprise. It was not a request he heard every day. He glanced at the girl, then at the piano, then back at her again. Before he could respond, a couple sitting at a nearby table overheard the question. The man looked over his shoulder with a small smile, clearly amused by what he had heard. The woman sitting across from him leaned slightly to see what was happening. Soon, another person at the next table noticed as well. The girl felt their eyes on her, and her cheeks became slightly warm, but she stayed where she was. The waiter scratched his head lightly, thinking about how to answer. "This piano is usually played by someone we invite in the evenings," he explained. "Not just anyone uses it." His tone was not rude, just uncertain. The girl nodded respectfully. She understood that completely. "I only need a minute," she said quietly. "Just to try." The waiter looked around the room. At this point several people were watching the small conversation. Some seemed curious, others looked slightly entertained. One person at a nearby table let out a small chuckle. Another guest whispered something to their friend, and both of them smiled as they looked toward the piano. The girl heard the quiet laughter. It wasn't loud or cruel, but it was enough to make the situation feel uncomfortable. A man sitting closer to the piano leaned back in his chair and said jokingly, "Maybe she thinks it's a toy." A few people around him laughed softly. The girl lowered her eyes for a second. Moments like this were not new to her. She had experienced similar reactions before when people assumed things about her just by looking at her clothes or her quiet personality. Still, she didn't move away. Instead, she waited patiently for the waiter to decide. The waiter seemed unsure about what to do. On one hand, he didn't want to cause trouble. On the other hand, the girl didn't seem like she meant any harm. He looked toward the counter where the restaurant manager was standing. The manager had also noticed the situation. After watching for a moment, the manager walked a few steps closer. He studied the girl carefully, trying to understand why she wanted to play. "You know how to play?" he asked. The girl paused before answering. She didn't want to lie. I have never played on a real piano before," she admitted honestly. That answer made several people laugh again. One guest shook his head with a grin. "Well, that should be interesting," he said sarcastically. Another person raised an eyebrow as if expecting a small disaster. The girl heard everything, but she stayed calm. The manager looked thoughtful. The situation had already caught the attention of many guests, and refusing her now might feel unnecessarily strict. Finally, he sighed lightly. "1 minute," he said. The room grew a little quieter. "Just 1 minute," he repeated. The girl looked up in surprise. "Thank you," she said quickly, her voice filled with relief. She turned back toward the piano. Behind her, a few people whispered to each other. Some expected her to play random notes and stop after a few seconds. Others were simply curious about what would happen. A man jokingly lifted his glass and said, "This should be fun." Another guest chuckled quietly. The girl slowly moved the piano bench and sat down. The seat felt firm beneath her, and for a brief moment her hands rested in her lap. The piano keys were right in front of her now, closer than they had ever been in her entire life. She stared at them quietly. Her heart was beating faster than before. Not because she was afraid of the people watching her, but because something important was about to happen. For years she had listened to music from outside windows and doorways. She had memorized melodies while standing in the streets. Now, for the first time, She was sitting in front of the instrument that had filled her imagination for so long. Behind her, the restaurant guests waited with mixed expressions. Some were curious. Some were amused. Some were still quietly laughing. But the girl barely noticed them anymore. She slowly lifted her hands. Her fingers hovered gently above the keys. For a few seconds she didn't press anything. She simply sat there, breathing slowly, letting the moment settle in her mind. Felt as if the entire room had paused. Even the people who had been laughing earlier were now watching more closely. The girl closed her eyes for a brief second. Inside her mind, dozens of melodies moved through her memory. Notes she had heard years ago. Songs she had memorized without realizing it. When she opened her eyes again, her hands were still waiting above the keys. One small movement was all it would take. And in just a few seconds, the entire room would realize they had completely misunderstood the quiet girl sitting at the piano. For a few seconds the restaurant felt unusually quiet. The girl sat still on the piano bench, her hands hovering gently above the keys. The soft lights above reflected on the smooth black surface of the piano, and the white keys seemed almost to glow under her fingers. Behind her, people waited. Some were leaning back in their chairs with small smiles, expecting something awkward to happen. A few guests had already whispered jokes to each other, thinking that the girl would probably press a few random notes and quickly give up. Others were simply curious. The waiter who had spoken to her earlier stood a few steps away, watching with his arms folded. The manager stood near the counter, keeping an eye on the situation but not interrupting. The girl didn't look back at anyone. Her focus stayed on the piano. Inside her mind, she was remembering the countless times she had stood outside windows listening to music. The melodies she had collected over the years moved through her memory like gentle waves. She remembered a slow piano piece she once heard late at night when a cafe door had been left open. She remembered another melody from a small music store where someone had been practicing in the afternoon. There were many little pieces like that, each one stored somewhere deep in her mind. She took a quiet breath. Then, slowly, her fingers lowered onto the keys. The first note appeared softly. It was clear and warm, filling the air in a way that immediately felt different from the random sound people were expecting. A few guests lifted their heads slightly. The girl pressed another note, then another. Her fingers moved carefully at first, almost like someone testing the water before stepping into it. The sound grew smoother. Within seconds, the notes began to connect together in a gentle melody. The man who had joked earlier about the piano being a toy stopped smiling. He leaned forward slightly, trying to understand what he was hearing. The couple sitting near the window paused their conversation. The waiter unfolded his arms. The girl's fingers continued moving, now more confidently. Her hands seemed to glide across the keys as if they had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. The melody grew stronger. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was soft and emotional, the kind of music that quietly fills a room and makes people stop what they are doing. At the table closest to the piano, a woman slowly placed her fork down on her plate. She turned her chair a little so she could see the girl more clearly. The man sitting across from her followed her gaze. The music continued flowing. There was something natural about the way the girl played. She didn't look tense or confused like someone who had never touched a piano before. Instead, her hands moved smoothly, almost like they knew exactly where each key was. Even though she had never practiced on a real piano, her memory guided her. Every note she had heard during those quiet moments outside cafes and shops seemed to guide her fingers now. The restaurant grew quieter with each passing second. A few people who had been talking earlier slowly stopped their conversations. Someone near the back of the room turned in their chair. The manager, who had been standing near the counter, stepped a little closer. The girl was no longer aware of the room around her. For her, the restaurant had disappeared. All she could feel was the piano beneath her hands and the music rising into the air. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with growing confidence. Sometimes they pressed soft notes that floated gently through the room. Other times they moved faster, creating small waves of sound that made the melody feel alive. The guests who had laughed earlier now looked completely different. The man who had made the sarcastic comment slowly shook his head in disbelief. Another guest whispered quietly, "Wait, she's actually playing." At a nearby table, a young boy stared at the piano with wide eyes. The girl continued playing without rushing. Her back was straight, and her shoulders were relaxed. Her face showed quiet concentration, but there was also something peaceful about her expression. It was as if she had finally arrived at a place she had always belonged. The melody shifted slightly, becoming a little deeper and more emotional. Some guests felt a strange feeling in their chest as they listened. The music carried a softness that made the busy world outside the restaurant feel far away. Even the staff stopped moving for a moment. Plates waited on trays. Orders paused halfway through preparation. Everyone was listening. The waiter who had first spoken to the girl slowly walked closer to the piano, his expression full of surprise. He watched her hands carefully. They were not moving randomly. Each movement had purpose. Each note fit perfectly with the next. The girl's fingers reached the higher keys, producing lighter notes that shimmered in the air. Then they returned to the middle of the keyboard, bringing the melody back to a warm and steady rhythm. A woman sitting near the back of the restaurant quietly reached for her phone. She didn't want to disturb the moment, but she felt that what was happening was special. She pressed record. Another guest did the same. But even those who held their phones didn't look at their screens very often. Their eyes kept returning to the girl at the piano. The laughter from earlier now felt distant and almost embarrassing. People exchanged quiet glances as if silently admitting they had judged her too quickly. The music continued for several minutes. Sometimes the melody felt hopeful. Sometimes it felt thoughtful and calm. The girl was no longer simply repeating something she had heard before. Now she was adding small touches of her own. Her fingers moved with freedom, letting the music grow naturally. The room remained completely silent except for the piano. Outside the restaurant window, cars passed by and people walked along the sidewalk without knowing what was happening inside. But inside that room, something special was unfolding. The girl slowly guided the melody toward its ending. The notes became softer again, just like the beginning. Her fingers pressed a few final keys, letting the sound gently fade into the quiet air. Then she lifted her hands. The last note hung in the room for a brief moment before disappearing. For a few seconds, no one moved. The silence that followed felt almost as powerful as the music itself. The girl sat still, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She took a small breath, finally becoming aware of the room again. And when she slowly turned her head, she saw something she had not expected. Every person in the restaurant was staring at her. But this time, no one was laughing. For a few long seconds after the final note faded, the restaurant stayed completely silent. It was the kind of silence that only appears when people are truly surprised. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the small sounds that usually filled the room, forks touching plates, glasses being lifted, chairs shifting, had stopped. The girl slowly lowered her hands into her lap. Her fingers were still slightly warm from touching the piano keys. She had been so focused on the music that she had almost forgotten where she was. Now she became aware of the room again. She slowly turned her head. Every person in the restaurant was looking at her. But this time their faces looked very different from before. The smiles of amusement were gone. The quiet laughter had disappeared. Instead, most of the guests looked stunned. Some had wide eyes. Others were leaning forward as if they had just witnessed something they didn't fully understand. The girl suddenly felt shy. She had not played the piano to impress anyone. She had simply followed the melodies she had carried in her mind for years. In that moment, she wondered if maybe she had stayed too long, or if she had done something wrong. She carefully slid off the piano bench. The sound of the bench moving slightly against the floor seemed loud in the silent room. She turned toward the manager and the waiter who had been standing nearby. For a second, she wasn't sure what to say. "Thank you for letting me try," she said quietly. Her voice was soft but clear. Still, no one answered immediately. The silence stretched for another moment. Then suddenly a single clap broke the quiet. Everyone's attention shifted toward the sound. It came from a table near the window where a middle-aged woman had been listening very carefully the entire time. She clapped once more. Then again. Within seconds, another person joined in. Then another. The sound of applause quickly spread across the room like a wave. People began clapping loudly, some even standing from their chairs. The quiet restaurant that had been full of doubt only minutes earlier was now filled with energy and excitement. The girl froze in place, surprised by the sudden reaction. She had not expected this at all. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, watching the people who were now applauding her. Some guests were smiling warmly. Others looked almost emotional, as if the music had touched them in a deep way. The waiter who had first spoken to her shook his head with a small laugh of disbelief while clapping along with everyone else. The manager stepped closer to the piano, still looking amazed. "I didn't expect that," he admitted honestly. The girl gave a small, shy smile but didn't say anything. At a nearby table, the man who had earlier joked that the piano wasn't a toy looked slightly embarrassed. He rubbed the back of his neck and avoided eye contact for a moment before joining the applause. Several guests began whispering to each other again, but now their voices carried excitement rather than mockery. "Where did she learn to play like that? Did you see her hands? I thought she said she had never played before." A young boy sitting with his family looked at the girl with admiration. "That was amazing," he said quietly to his parents. Meanwhile, a couple of people who had been recording earlier were still holding their phones, replaying short clips of the performance. One person shook their head in disbelief while watching the video. "I can't believe we almost missed that," they murmured. The girl remained standing beside the piano, unsure of what she should do next. The applause slowly began to fade as people returned to their seats, but the atmosphere in the room had clearly changed. The manager stepped closer. "You said you had never played a real piano before?" he said, studying her carefully. The girl nodded. "That's true," she replied honestly. The manager looked at the piano, then back at her. "But you played like someone who has been practicing for years." The girl hesitated for a moment, thinking about how to explain something that had always felt natural to her. "I listen to music a lot," she said simply. "Whenever I hear piano music, I try to remember it." Some of the guests nearby leaned closer, curious to hear her answer. "You remember it?" the waiter asked with surprise. She nodded again. "I stand outside places where music is playing," she explained quietly. "Sometimes cafes, sometimes music shops. I listen carefully and try to remember the melody." The people listening exchanged surprised glances. "You mean you learned by listening?" someone asked. "Yes," she said softly. A few guests shook their heads in amazement. The woman who had started the applause stepped forward slightly. "That kind of memory is rare," she said warmly. "You have something very special." The girl lowered her eyes again, feeling a little overwhelmed by all the attention. She had never been the center of a room before. At another table, a group of friends continued discussing the performance. "I swear, when she first asked to play, I thought it was going to be awkward," one of them admitted. "Me too," another replied. "I feel bad for laughing earlier." Across the room, someone else added quietly, "Sometimes we judge too quickly." The girl heard bits and pieces of these conversations, but she tried not to focus on them. Her attention drifted back to the piano. For years it had been something distant, something she could only imagine. Now she had finally touched it, even if just for a few minutes. The feeling stayed in her chest like a warm memory. The manager folded his arms thoughtfully. "You know," he said slowly, "we sometimes have live music here in the evenings." The girl looked up at him, unsure what he meant. He continued speaking. "If you ever want to come back and play again, you are welcome to." The girl blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected that kind of invitation. Before she could answer, another guest spoke from a nearby table. "Yes, please come back," the man said with a smile. "That was the best music we've heard here in a long time." A few others nodded in agreement. The girl felt her cheeks warm again, but this time it was from gratitude rather than embarrassment. "Thank you," she said quietly. The waiter laughed softly. I guess tonight we all learned something, he said. The manager raised an eyebrow. What's that? The waiter smiled. Never judge someone before hearing them play. A few guests chuckled warmly at the comment. Outside the restaurant window, the evening continued as usual. Cars passed, people walked by, and the busy city kept moving without knowing the small story that had just unfolded inside that room. But for the people who had been there, the moment felt unforgettable. A quiet girl had walked in, been laughed at, and then completely changed the atmosphere with nothing more than a few minutes of music. And even though the piano had fallen silent again, the feeling left behind by those notes still lingered in the air. The applause slowly faded, but the energy inside the restaurant did not disappear. Instead, the room felt warmer than before, almost like everyone had just shared an unexpected moment together. Conversations began again, but they sounded different now. People were speaking with excitement, and many of them were still looking toward the piano. The girl remained standing beside it, unsure whether she should leave or stay for a moment longer. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. Normally she preferred quiet corners where no one noticed her. But tonight was different. Several guests were still talking about her performance. Some were replaying the short videos they had recorded, while others were simply describing the moment to the people sitting beside them. One guest shook his head slowly while looking at the piano. I still can't believe that just happened, he said. Another person laughed softly. When she first asked to play, I thought we were about to hear random notes for a minute. Same here, someone else replied. I feel bad for laughing earlier. The man who had made the joking comment before leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful look on his face. Earlier he had spoken without thinking much about it, assuming the situation would be harmless entertainment. Now he realized he had been completely wrong. He stood up from his table and walked a few steps closer to the piano. The girl noticed him approaching and felt a little nervous again. She wondered if he might say something critical. Instead, the man stopped a few feet away and gave a small respectful nod. I owe you an apology, he said honestly. The girl looked surprised. I shouldn't have laughed earlier, he continued. That was my mistake. She didn't know what to say at first, so she simply smiled politely. It's okay, she replied gently. The man smiled back, clearly relieved that she wasn't upset. Nearby, the waiter who had first spoken to her earlier was still standing close to the piano. He looked at the girl with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. I've worked here for 3 years, he said. I've heard many musicians play on that piano, but I've never seen someone sit down and play like that on their first try. The girl lowered her eyes slightly. I didn't know if I could do it, she admitted quietly. Well, you definitely did, the waiter said with a grin. At a nearby table, a woman who had been recording earlier stood up and approached them. She held her phone in her hand. Look at this, she said, showing the screen. On the phone was a short video clip of the girl playing the piano. Even through the small speaker, the melody still sounded beautiful. I recorded a little of your performance, the woman explained. I hope you don't mind. The girl shook her head. That's okay, she said. Several people standing nearby leaned in to watch the clip. One of them smiled widely. This is incredible, he said. People are going to love this. The girl didn't fully understand what he meant, but she nodded politely anyway. Meanwhile, the manager had been quietly observing everything from a short distance away. He looked thoughtful as he watched the small crowd gathered around the piano. Finally, he stepped forward again. Excuse me, he said, addressing the girl. She turned to face him. You mentioned earlier that you learned music just by listening, he said. Yes, she replied. The manager folded his arms and studied her for a moment. That kind of natural ability is very rare, he said slowly. Most people practice for years to develop that level of feeling when they play. The girl looked slightly embarrassed by the compliment. I just like music, she said. The manager smiled. Well, music seems to like you back. A few people nearby laughed softly at the comment. Then the manager continued speaking. If you ever want to practice on this piano during quiet hours, you can come by. I can arrange a time when the restaurant is not busy. The girl blinked in surprise again. She had never expected an opportunity like that. Really? She asked softly. The manager nodded. Yes, talent should not go to waste. The girl felt a wave of gratitude she didn't quite know how to express. Thank you, she said sincerely. At another table, a young boy tugged gently on his father's sleeve. Can she play another song? He asked quietly. The father smiled and looked toward the girl. A few other guests seemed to have the same idea. Someone called out playfully, "One more song." Another voice joined in, "Yes, play another." The girl looked toward the manager, unsure if that would be allowed. The manager chuckled. "Well," he said, "I think everyone here would enjoy that." The girl hesitated for a moment. Playing the first time had felt natural because she hadn't been thinking about the audience. Now that everyone was watching her with excitement, she felt a little nervous. But then she looked at the piano again. The familiar feeling returned. She slowly sat back down on the piano bench. The room grew quiet once more as people waited. This time, however, the silence felt different. Instead of doubt or curiosity, it was filled with anticipation. The girl placed her hands gently above the keys again. For a moment she thought about the music she wanted to play next. Then she began. The second melody was slightly brighter than the first one. It moved a little faster, with light notes that seemed to dance across the room. Some guests smiled immediately when the music started. A few people softly tapped their fingers against the table in rhythm with the melody. The young boy who had asked for another song watched with shining eyes. The girl's fingers moved smoothly across the keyboard again. Even though she had only discovered the piano's touch minutes earlier, it now felt strangely familiar. The music flowed naturally just like before. Once again, conversations stopped. Once again, the restaurant filled only with the sound of the piano. But this time, instead of surprise, the room was filled with admiration. The same people who had laughed earlier were now completely absorbed in the music. And as the girl continued to play, it became clear that what had started as a simple request to try the piano had turned into something much bigger. The quiet girl who had once stood outside windows listening to music had finally found a place where her melodies could be heard. The second melody slowly came to an end, and the final notes floated gently through the restaurant before fading into silence. For a moment no one spoke again, just like the first time she had finished playing. But this time the silence was full of admiration rather than surprise. Then the applause returned. It was even louder than before. People clapped warmly, some smiling widely, others shaking their heads in disbelief, as if they still could not understand how someone who claimed to have never played a piano before could perform like that. The girl slowly lifted her hands from the keys and stood up from the bench again. Her heart was beating a little faster now, but she also felt a quiet happiness inside. Playing the piano had felt natural, almost like something she had been waiting her whole life to do. The young boy who had asked for another song clapped enthusiastically and looked at her with excitement. "That was beautiful," he said loudly. His parents smiled and nodded in agreement. Several other guests joined the compliments. "That was amazing. You have real talent. I've never heard anything like that here before." The girl listened quietly, feeling a little overwhelmed by the attention. She was not used to people praising her. Most days she simply moved through the city unnoticed. The waiter who had spoken with her earlier walked closer again, still smiling. "Well," he said jokingly, "I think we found our new pianist tonight." Some of the guests laughed warmly at that comment. The manager stepped forward as well, clearly pleased with how the evening had turned out. The atmosphere inside the restaurant had completely changed from what it had been earlier. "You've made this evening very special," he said kindly to the girl. She lowered her head slightly in gratitude. "I'm glad you enjoyed it," she replied softly. Across the room, a few guests were still watching the video clips they had recorded. One woman showed the video to her friend and whispered excitedly, "This moment is going to stay with me for a long time," she said. Her friend nodded. "It's not every day you see something like this." Near the window, the man who had apologized earlier turned to the people sitting at his table. "You know what I learned tonight?" he said thoughtfully. "What?" one of them asked. He glanced toward the girl and then back at his friends. Never assume you know someone's story just by looking at them. His friends quietly agreed. Meanwhile, the girl stepped away from the piano and stood beside it again. For a brief moment she looked at the instrument with a soft smile. Only an hour earlier she had been standing outside the window, unsure if she would ever even touch the keys. Now she had played not just once but twice, and an entire room full of strangers had listened. It felt almost unreal. The manager noticed the thoughtful look on her face. "You're welcome here any time," he reminded her. "If you want to practice or play again, just let us know." The girl nodded gratefully. "Thank you," she said again. She knew opportunities like this did not come easily, and she appreciated the kindness that had been shown to her tonight. The restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Guests resumed their meals, waiters carried plates across the room, and conversations began again. But even though things seemed normal on the surface, something had changed. Every now and then someone would glance toward the piano and smile, remembering the unexpected performance. The girl picked up her small bag from where she had placed it earlier. She knew it was time for her to go home. Her mother would probably be wondering where she was. Before leaving, she turned toward the manager and the waiter once more. "Thank you for letting me play," she said sincerely. The waiter shook his head with a friendly grin. "No," he replied. "Thank you for the music." The manager nodded in agreement. "You turned an ordinary evening into something unforgettable." The girl smiled shyly and began walking toward the door. As she passed the tables, several guests offered small waves or kind words. "Good luck. Keep playing. You have a bright future." She thanked them politely as she continued toward the exit. When she reached the door and stepped outside, the cool evening air greeted her again. The street looked just as busy as before. Cars moved past, people walked along the sidewalk, and the city lights reflected on the pavement. To anyone passing by, nothing unusual seemed to have happened. But inside the restaurant behind her, people were still talking about the quiet girl who had walked in and surprised everyone with her music. The girl paused for a moment on the sidewalk. Through the window she could still see the piano standing in the same place. This time, however, it didn't feel distant anymore. It felt like the beginning of something new. She took a deep breath and started walking home. Her steps felt lighter than usual. For years she had only listened to music from outside doors and windows. She had memorized melodies while standing quietly on sidewalks, never knowing if she would ever get the chance to play them herself. Tonight that had changed. And sometimes, all it takes is one moment of courage to open a door that once seemed impossible to enter. The people inside the restaurant would remember that evening for a long time. Some would tell the story to their friends. Some would replay the short videos they had recorded. Others would simply hold the memory in their minds as a reminder. A reminder that talent can appear in the most unexpected places. A reminder that laughter can quickly turn into respect. And most importantly, a reminder that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one with the most powerful story to tell. As the girl continued walking through the softly lit streets, the melodies she had played still echoed gently in her mind. But this time they were not just memories. They were the beginning of her own music.